You're listening to Uncovered with Bharat Sundaresan and Jarrod Kimber on the 99.94 network. That seemed to pause for longer at the end than I thought it was going to be. Hey, Bharat, how are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, Jared. Yeah, that now sounded very good to me. This
Yep.
this looks very good to me, and I can't believe we waited so long to make our relationship public and have our own little podcast.
Yes, for those who don't know, we are adding an extra day of Red Inca called Uncovered, where me and Bharat will talk whatever we want to, really. For those who don't know who Bharat is, I'm going to go through all this. When I miss something, you just let me know. Indian Express for a long time, and you wrote the book The Donny Way. You're the Patrick Patterson guy, or whisperer, perhaps. You quite often a random smiley face on Australian TV. You do a bit of commentary. You're a big metal and wrestling fan, and you're currently with Crickbuzz. Have I missed out anything there?
You didn't speak about my hair, but that is all right. It gets spoken of way too much, I think, at some level. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, and what I have another book coming up early next year,
Oh, of
so
course, yeah.
early plug for that. Early plug for that. It's called the Miracle Makers. It's pretty much about India's tour of Australia, the famous one, 2020, 2021. Apart from that, yeah, I think I'm a happy person as well. I like to be referred to as a very happy person.
Not on this podcast. But one other thing that I want to mention is this for the 7 people who don't know Bharat, here's a story that explains him as well as anyone. Recently, I tried to get in touch with him so we could hook up and plan this podcast and some other podcasts we're working on. And he said, I can't talk to you at that time because I've got to pick up my friend's mum from the airport. And then I'm driving her back home and then I'm lending her my car. And then you added, and this is the best bit, that you hadn't actually met your friend's mum before. So you were just lending this random woman your car after picking her up from the airport. That's the most Bharat story I think I'm aware of.
Just to add on that, she also ended up spending 3 days with us at home, and we took her all around South Australia. She left last evening, so yeah, we extended our generosity, our hospitality, because that's what you do. That's what you're supposed to do. She's a lovely woman as well.
Yeah, I'm sure she was. We talked about all the different things you've worked on, but you're also a podcast guy. That's why we've got you involved with 99.94. We've got a big podcast that we'll probably announce next week or the week after that you're working on with someone else. But you listen to a lot of wrestling podcasts and MMA or heavy metal or just wrestling?
Mostly wrestling, pro wrestling. I'm a big fan of the business and there's some wonderful former wrestlers, former promoters, bookers, as they were called, running podcasts, and it's just fascinating. And I think what fascinates me about pro wrestling is not so much the in-ring stuff, which I guess what attracted me originally, but it's the storytelling aspect of it. And I think at the base of it, you and I are storytellers, right? Whether we do it in print or we do it in podcasts or on radio or on TV, we're just telling stories all the time. And that's something I've done all my life from the time I was very young and I used to come back from preschool and tell my mother about the kids in school and what they were up to while mimicking all of them. So I've always done that. And I think pro wrestling is just made for someone like me. So I listen to a lot of that. Heavy metal, yeah, not very well, but I used to play the drums many, many years ago. We had a metal band in Bombay, which didn't do too well. It was called Warhead, of course. I used to do some vocals as well. So I do, yeah, anything metal. I'm always on board, and thrash metal mainly. But like most metalheads, I have graduated to listening to classical music and jazz music because if you aren't a metal fan, as you know, can come across as being loud and just a lot of noise, but it is just an extension of classical music.
Yeah, I remember, trying to explain to many girlfriends about that with Cradle of Filth. Never quite worked. But
Nah, nah.
let's so we're going to chat about a couple of things that we've both been looking at or working on recently. I'm going to start with the one day international thing that I noticed. So I was watching, I think it was when Australia were being rolled by New
Mm.
Zealand, or Australia were rolling New Zealand and the Zimbabwe game. Someone tweeted me to say, have they changed the ball? Because suddenly everyone's taking lots of wickets. And my first thing is, like, when I get a message like that, I'm always like, mate, you've just seen a couple of wickets on the TV. It doesn't mean anything, right?
Exactly.
And I think that's what, if you look at that, the original tweet response, I think that's literally almost what I said. And then I was like, I'll look it up for this person. And suddenly I was like, holy shit, there's been a huge change since basically late 2020. And we can trace that back to, we're pretty sure, although not 100% sure, that's when Kookaburra changed the ball. And so in ODI cricket, we're about 38 runs a game down on what we would normally be. And it's really the power plays that have changed, Bharat. So beforehand, everyone was smashing the ball around the power play. It was business as usual. And then when they got these new balls in, obviously they're seeing me around a little bit more. I can't remember, when was the Women's World Cup in New Zealand? Was that last year?
That was last year, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wait.
So,
yeah, last year.
because I can't remember which team I was talking to, but I was talking to one of the teams, and that their plan to Meg Lanning was a wobble ball, right? And it didn't actually make any sense. And now I was thinking about it going, oh, because people weren't bowling the wobble ball in white ball cricket before then, because the seam was made of Play-Doh. And there was no point bowling the wobble ball, right? You just tried and swing it early on. Now teams are trying to do that. So essentially, what I managed to trace it back to is the fact that when Dukes got that contract in the Sheffield Shield, so what was that, around 2016, 2017?
Yeah, 2017, I think, yeah.
Yeah, so around that time, that's when Kookaburra suddenly went, oh, we might lose all of our business. And they went about redoing their balls, and they spent about 2, 3, 4 years testing them. And what they did was they reinforced the seam so that the ball would do more. Right. So all their research had told them, and this is good because I've never heard anyone in cricket say this before, but from what I can tell, all their research told them that the more attractive games were usually the ones with more wickets. Right. And that Kookaburra balls, who would have thought it? And that Kookaburra balls weren't particularly producing attractive cricket. Right. So what they did, I got a ball here. And it is a Kookaburra, so they'll be upset. But what they basically did is they reinforced the seam just underneath. And then it made it a little bit more prominent as well, which means that when you're bowling your wobble balls, there's more to hit. And also it stays hard for longer, right?
Yeah.
But of course, well, the first time we saw this ball in action, it was actually a pink ball, right? And it was the Adelaide test that you've probably written about in your book, right? And that was the first time that ball was used. But the whole thing was about fixing the red ball. But here's what's funny about all this, mate, is that the white ball is an absolute flaming piece of shit and has been since the umpires in, the early 80s used to have paint in their pocket to smear on it to keep it white for longer, right? Like we have, N. Srinivasan used to say, it's the reason we use 2 white balls in one-day cricket is racist. It's to stop spinners and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, no, it's because we already had 2 white balls. The difference was before we used to replace one at 35 overs with one that would last the next 15 overs, right?
Yeah.
And so they fixed the red ball, and then it looks like they've just copied over that same design to the white ball. The actual white ball is still a piece of shit that falls apart. That's not Kookaburra's fault. That's just because the white leather can't be, or you can't dye leather white, right?
Yeah.
But the problem is that they've created this other problem at the top of the game where the balls are now just nipping around everywhere. And so we have this change in international cricket, which is fairly massive, right? And I have 2 issues with it. And I want to know your opinions on this. But the first opinion is that it happened because a company basically was worried about being a small company and losing its market, right? That shouldn't happen if you make 89% of international balls. And the other part is, even if the ICC knew about this, and I can assure you 100% they did not. In fact, until they saw my video, they may not have been aware that this happened at all. Even if they knew about it, I'm not sure what they could have done about it. They're just a company that purchase balls. And I know they purchase a lot, but I'm not sure they would purchase more balls than England or South Africa or some of these other countries, or India. Anyone who plays a lot of domestic white ball cricket probably buys more white balls than ICC. They wouldn't make up a huge amount of the money anyway. So even if they knew about it, mate, there's nothing they could have actually done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And a few points on that. The World Cup in New Zealand, before we are corrected and cancelled, did happen earlier this year. It's just that there's so much cricket that happens around the world that
after COVID, we're allowed to make those mistakes because time is no longer, it works in the normal curve.
That is very, very true. And it almost it's scary that the world is going back to normal in a way, right? It's you don't know what to expect anymore because we've forgotten what life was like before that happened. And yeah, one of the main reasons Cricket Australia did start using or bring in the Duke's ball for the second half of the Sheffield Shield for what 3 or 4 seasons was because it was all in preparation for the 2019 Ashes, and they stopped it right after the 2019 Ashes. So 2020, no, 2000, 2019 2020 season, it was Kookaburra first half and second half. And like you said, the pressure and the one thing about Dukes is Dilip Jajodia, their owner, doesn't mind giving interviews, right? And also doesn't mind letting journalists into his workshop to tell them not just how their balls are made, the Dukes, but also a lot about like the Kookaburra. And the one thing um, you learn when you go there is how every Duke's ball, the seam is hand stitched,
Mm.
whereas with the Kookaburra, as you know, it's machine stitch, or it used to be. So in a way, Kookaburra knew what they had to do to get their balls up to scratch in a way. Even though, like you said, they weren't really under that big a threat, except maybe in some pockets here and there. You would hear the some of the Indian spinners complain about the Kookaburra briefly when they used the Kookaburra ball a lot in India, and then they went back to SG balls. So yeah, it's fascinating that. Jared Kimber had to inform the ICC about the fact that there is a massive change happening in one-day cricket. Maybe a good change. There's
Yeah,
so
that's the
much
other
talk
thing,
about
isn't
that.
it? Like it
Exactly. They
I
should be
was thinking
excited
that a
about
lot of
this.
people were going to read my piece and go, "Great, that's what we want." Now there are more wickets, and it's keeping because it was the first time in history that one-day averages had gone ahead of Test averages, right? And that's a big deal because for
It is.
generations we're used to that being the opposite, and so it was like everyone had worked out white ball batting, and no one could work out red ball batting. So you're right. I do think though I do think that even though you and I know that part of the reason the Dukes was used in Sheffield Shield was to prepare the cricketers for the Ashes, that
Yeah.
pressure is really what gets to Kookaburra because the Kookaburra ball had been maligned for about 15 years at that point,
Oh yeah.
right? Like really, really maligned, talking about softness, talking about not suiting different conditions and all that sort of thing. And nothing had done, they just hadn't done anything that we know of. As you said, Dukes will hold a press conference if they put an apostrophe in their name or if they put a hyphen in for a new company. Kookaburra, absolutely nothing at all.
Mm.
And I contacted Kookaburra about 4 different ways because I was like, surely they've got to get back to me eventually on all this, and they just never did. So there's a huge difference. If you look at the baseball balls,
Yeah.
right? Do you remember they went flat? Dukes, if you go back, Dukes were talking about that, I think even before the test matches started. They were like, this is a bad batch. Sorry, it's going to happen. And then
Yeah.
the minute that test series finished, I think it was Paul Newman was brought in for the Daily Mail to do a tour of their factory. They were like, these are the new ones. This is what we've done. They're going to play great. And it's like, look at those 2 different summers. In one summer, you literally couldn't hit the ball off the square.
Yeah.
And then the other one, it was we could chase 300 without,
Yeah. Exactly.
with our trousers down. So I
Mm.
think, quite clearly there's a difference in those two companies, but it does show you that there's a bigger issue here. That this change has happened, and the boards don't know, the ICC don't know, but also just that even if they did know, no one really is in charge of cricket balls, right?
Yeah.
So
That's true.
I don't know how you fix that.
And I'm surprised. I mean, they have like so many committees at the ICC. And when you think about it, the two things that sort of matter the most in cricket is the bat and the ball. Maybe it's time there is a ball committee, and especially balls. I mean, yeah, with bats, you have certain specifications and certain uh, protocols as to like the width and the length and all of that. But with cricket balls, because they have such a big say in how a cricket match works out, you would think there's a balls committee. And I've had like a lot of non-journalist cricket fans just walk up to me and say, why can't there just be a standardized ball? Like, why can't there just be one kind of ball that gets used all around the world, where there's a lot of science? Maybe all these companies come together and create this ball. But that's not, but we also have to realize cricket balls, selling cricket balls is a great business because, like you said, it's not just at international level or even
Mm.
the BCCI and Cricket Australia who purchased these balls. It's right through the grassroots systems, right? And you also are in an era where those who can in T20 cricket, T20 batters who are working on their own game, who spend who are hiring grounds and hiring coaches and hiring bowlers to face while preparing for the various T20 leagues. They are purchasing balls on a personal front as well. So there is it's a great business. So I don't see any standardizing of the ball happening at that level. Just because why would you?
No, I mean, if cricket was run properly, the ICC would do what baseball had done and just buy the ball manufacturers. But I've got a good one for you about bats, and somehow I've never managed to write this. But do you remember when they changed the size of the edges on the bats? So MCC did that, and they did a lot of testing on it. And I think I was the only journalist asking to see the test results. So finally, someone sort
Right.
of comes over and they show me the test results. And so I'm looking through it, and I'm saying to the person from the MCC, yeah, your test results aren't saying what you think they're saying. Actually, what they're saying is that the best bat design ever, and it doesn't matter how thick the edges are, is the scoop. Because what the scoop
Oh,
did was it opens up the power spot, the center, the middle, whatever you want to call it, right, of the bat, because of the weird design of the scoop. So for those who don't remember, it's the famous bat from the 80s with the big scoop in the back. We see
yeah.
them come back into fashion every now and again, but modern batters don't seem to love them as much as anyone else. And I was like, it's not the size of the edges. And also, the other thing they worked out was when they cut a bat in the style of a 1905 bat that was £2.8, and then they cut a modern one with the same modern wood, they actually hit the ball just as far. Sometimes the middles were
Mm.
slightly different because the old designs of the bats weren't quite as good. But realistically, like it didn't matter. You could thin the edges down as much as you wanted. It's because of the way that they treat the wood now, and it's the way that they do spread that middle far more than they
Yeah.
used to. Um, Again, they were under so much pressure, probably because of what happened in golf. And there was so much on TV about, remember the Barry Richards picture where he's holding up the old
Oh,
bat
yeah,
and
yeah,
and
of
the
course.
David
Yeah.
Warner bat, that they just changed it. It didn't matter that you could prove kind of 100% that wasn't the biggest issue here. And in fact, there was a far bigger issue. We needed to get to this bigger issue. So it doesn't surprise me at all. And then, of course, you've got the pitches, of which we now have the hybrid pitches, of which
Yeah.
I still haven't seen a ruling on what a hybrid pitch is and what a hybrid pitch is not. And I put in that article, mate, you would have seen it, that literally they talked to Gary Stead and they waited to see if any of the women at the Commonwealth Games complained that much. Every
Yeah.
player I've talked to has said, don't know about these hybrid pitches, because apparently what happens is if the ball hits the turf, it comes off at one speed, and if it hits
Oh,
the hybrid bit, the
yeah.
thread, it
Yeah.
comes off at a different speed. That doesn't seem like an ideal. I don't want to be players. You know what this is like. Players moan about everything, right? So
Yeah.
I'm
Of
more than
course.
happy to go. Okay, that's fine. But shouldn't there be a test so that we can see if what their players are saying is correct? And instead, it's like if two teams agree to a hybrid pitch, we can use them. And I do get the idea. They will be great for tournament play. They'll probably be
Oh,
great for
yeah.
women in associate cricket. But let's just check them beforehand, because that's what happened with the pink ball, and that's why the pink ball still sucks.
Exactly. I mean, these things do get forced down the players' throats, and uh, yeah, like you said, they would be resistant to change, right? It could have an impact on their career.
Mm,
Like you said, you play one tournament on hybrid pitches, whatever it is, women's cricket, associate cricket, or cricket at any level, and you get worked over by these all these discrepancies of the pitch of the hybrid pitch. That could be it for you. So I think they do deserve to have a say, and most of them are going to start slightly uh, unsure of it.
mm,
Like cricket doesn't do change. Cricket finds itself in a position where it has to adapt to change more than most other sports. And it doesn't do change too well to start with. Eventually, cricketers and everybody around cricket and the sport itself kind of adjust, whether it's to a new format or even new rules. Initially, everything's no, we
Yeah.
cannot change this aspect of it. But then, you're right, though. I mean, especially with so much cricket happening all around the world, and travel not being very cheap either. So, like with the Commonwealth Games, because it was the Commonwealth Games, of course, you had to stick to one city or one venue, but it could be a great model for some of these, uh, like, countries who don't have the money power of an India or an England to have hybrid pitches and have like entire tournaments being played on them.
I agree. I think it could be a great thing for cricket. I just think a bit like the pink ball. You should just test it first, just to see. Or
Yeah,
even just come up with a definition of what a hybrid pitch is. Um,
that would be better.
Coming up after the break, mate, we'll be talking about T20 cricket.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
Welcome back to Uncovered with Jarrod Kimber and Bharat Sundaresan. You have a very interesting piece that I think you're working on. You're workshopping. We're spitballing here about T20 cricket in Australia. And essentially, this is what you told me off air, and I wouldn't want to put words in your mouth, but you said that Big Bash is absolutely a terrible system, and it's ruining T20, and everyone in Australia doesn't understand the sport. Those were your words, of course, but if you'd like to
Of
elaborate.
course, they were my words. Yeah, you can read them as well because I'm going to put it in those very words. No, look, I think there is this anonymity to T20 cricket in Australia. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't mean that Australia doesn't play enough T20 cricket or there isn't enough T20 cricket that gets played here. But because actually Australia don't play as many T20 internationals as, say, some of these other countries do on home soil, whether it's England, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka,
Bulgaria.
or most other countries. Yeah, Bulgaria, Romania.
Bulgaria play a lot.
especially,
I just saw that today. I'm just throwing it out there.
Oh, really?
Bulgaria actually play a lot of games. So continue. And
Oh, yeah.
Uganda.
But I think Romania is the one who have a lot of records. Like if you go up
Yes.
and look, T20I records, there's a lot of Romanian records in there. And the Czechs aren't too bad either. But and you think of the big names in T20 cricket or world cricket, and you think and try to see how many T20 matches they played on Australian soil. Not too many. Whether it's a Kohli or a Warner or a Chris Gale. I mean, Chris Gale's gone now, but whether it's a Puran or any of those guys, including the Australians, right? Well, David Warner's played 3 BBL games in the last 8 or 9 years. He doesn't always feature in T20 internationals when Australia play because he's on a break from Test cricket or whatever it is. The schedule's so packed for Australia. Josh Hazelwood hasn't played before he became this T20 bowler of great renown in the last 18 months. He barely played T20 cricket here. Mitchell Stark hasn't played in the BBL for a long time. And a lot of them, especially the fast bowlers, are resting when Australia do play the odd occasional T20I international series on home soil. So it's anonymous. I mean, there are a lot of unknowns for the Australian players themselves. And then because the Big Bash in the last 6 or 7 years hasn't been what it used to be in the beginning, where not a lot of big name players from around the world come and play in it. And like we just established, even the main Australian team guys don't play in it except a Maxwell or a Stoinis or a Finch. What to make of those numbers? Like, for example, once the T20 World Cup starts and you are at the SCG and someone says, in today's day and age, the stats will pop up. Oh, at the SCG, if you win the toss on so and so day, this is what you're supposed to do. But what is the basis of it? Like, what's the context there? Like, can you use the numbers from, say, when some very good Australian players have played against some slightly better Australian players and use it in a World Cup in an international level format or in a context of that scale? I don't know, because in the IPL or in the PSL or on these other leagues, you have a lot of players who will be playing the World Cup also play in those tournaments. So it adds a little more gravitas to those numbers, if it makes sense. And so I thought there is this anonymity to T20 cricket in Australia, which is fascinating considering the fact that Australia is one of the bigger nations, or the big three, or whatever you want to call them. And yet we don't know much about that format here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really weird. Like when you told me about this before, I was thinking about it. So I think you might have come up with some of these names. I might have added to it. So you got Ben McDermott, Chris Lynn, Dan Christian,
Yeah.
Josh Phillippe, Ben Cutting, Ben Dunk. There's a lot of Bens in that list.
True,
Those
true,
are
true.
mostly batters, obviously a couple of all-rounders there as well. But most of those players, we haven't picked them by accident. We've picked them because they haven't quite made it at international level or the IPL, or in some cases both, right? And Josh Phillippe, I still think's really good, and he may pull himself out of that. But
Yeah.
there are a lot of guys. I saw one of the best players over like Jordan Silk and Matthew Short over the last 2 years at Big Bash have phenomenal records. John O'Wells is another one. And I'm a huge fan of John O'Wells. I made that video about him a couple of years ago. But realistically, you're looking at those players and going, okay, so if I'm recruiting now for the PSL or the CPL or the IPL or the 100, how many of those players am I really thinking are automatic selections, right? And you had a story about that with Ben McDermott, didn't you?
Oh yeah, very much so. And when Ben McDermott was player of the tournament, or definitely the highest run getter during last year's BBL, and the BBL finished just before the IPL auction. There was this big hype around him and how much he'll go for. It was a big auction as well. 2 new teams as well. I got calls from journalists in India and a lot of our friends in Australia as well, asking about whether they should include Ben McDermott as one of the must picks, or one of the Australian players who'll go for a lot of money. And I said, I would be very surprised if he gets picked. And nothing against Ben McDermott. I actually love watching him bat. And since that the BBL, he scored runs in Pakistan. He's done really well in the few opportunities he has got. It's not on him that he hasn't played consistently for Australia. I think eventually he will. But it's just that his numbers, especially batting numbers in the BBL, from what I've seen and I've heard from people who make these decisions in the IPL, don't count for much. Unless you're someone like a Tim David who just brings something extraordinary. Like you can just see him do what he does and it'll work in any condition. And Tim David, also to talk him up, he also did the same in the PSL and elsewhere. When you have a batter like Ben McDermott, who's a proper conventional batter, who has scored a lot of runs, who's got a strike rate. I mean, I'm no expert on Ben McDermott, even if it is between 130 and 140. You would think that's a good buy, but why would you want him to be one of only 10 overseas players in your team in the IPL, or in many of these other leagues? That's the question that gets asked, and that's why you've seen. And in the past, maybe 5 years ago, BBL performances counted for a lot more. I mean, that's where you saw the likes of Travis Head and Nick Maddinson and all these guys get picked up in the IPL. And after a point, you realize maybe not. Oh, you don't even have to look that far back, Jared. Last year, if you remember, when Riley Meredith and Jai Richardson, based purely on how they went in the BBL, went for a lot of money. Because by then, I think the IPL guys had stopped looking at batting performances, but maybe they thought, look, if we have these really big fast bowlers coming through, and it's always a phase in T20 cricket, right? It was a fast bowling phase. They maybe felt like it's the right time. Let's target these Australian fast bowlers. And unfortunately, in both their cases, it flopped, right? I mean, they didn't get enough opportunities, or and they also went to a team, Kings 11 Punjab, who are always looking for results rapidly, so they didn't get a long run, and that was it for them. I mean, they didn't even feature in the auction this time, or nobody seemed interested in either of them. Eventually Riley Meredith did get picked up by Mumbai, of course. So it again brings us back to the point of T20 cricket in Australia. How do you read it? Like, how do you contextualize it? Like, do those numbers mean a lot? And which kind of, if anything, makes the World Cup coming up even more exciting? Because I don't know who's a favorite and who's not, based on that the unknowns that do exist in T20 cricket here.
Yeah, it's really weird. I've said for a long time that, and I'm completely backed up by people within some of the teams as well, that Australians don't really get T20 cricket. And there's still this whole thing towards anchors. Like if you look at the Tim David one, I think he's really interesting because really couldn't get a game in for Scorchers for a long time.
Yeah.
Wasn't seen as the sort of player that they wanted. I know they had a lot of talent there, and obviously that was the whole Justin Langer period as well, where he was beefing up
True.
the team at times. But they didn't really get him, and he made his name outside of it. And then there's another player who I think is really interesting. So you talked about Riley Meredith and Jai Richardson, but it was Nathan Alice who's probably gone on to be one of
Yeah.
the better ones, and yet he's not that fast. And again, picked up some wickets overseas. So almost now you need to probably pair it in two different leagues, right? So Inglis might be another one who might get a go because he was good in the Big Bash and was good in say the Blast or something else. But just being good in one league doesn't seem to do as much for you. But there's, I think if you talk to top level analysts and people like me, so bottom level analysts, there's no big name Aussie players, right? So there's more press releases about David Warner joining a new or signing for his same team or about to move teams than he's actually made runs in the Big Bash. The big name players really don't come that much anymore. And even if they do, there's only one per team at most. There's hardly any overseas players at all because of the way that the league is structured, right? And within the game of T20, it's not particularly that highly rated. So I think if you would, and I'm not saying that this is a definitive list, but I think if you talk to most people in T20 cricket who do either coaching or franchise work, or analyst work or whatever that may be in multiple franchises, they'd probably say the IPL is the best. They'd say the PSL is probably clearly second, CPL just behind it. The 100 is coming up quite fast. So with that, you would say that at the moment, Big Bash is probably fourth or fifth at best, with the South African League about to probably go past it. And that's not including the UAE and the US League that we don't even know how strong they are particularly going to be, right? It's a very low-level league. It's better than whatever happened to Bangladesh, which was good for a little while. True. The Lankan Premier League and New Zealand, those are very low-level leagues. But other than that, it's kind of at the best middle of the road. And part of the reason is just the way it's set up. It's set up to be a really good TV product with repeat. It's almost set up to be the John O'Well's TV product, right? Where we can make stars from John O'Well's and Chris Lynn, but those players won't necessarily be stars internationally anymore. That's a completely different kind of product than some of these other leagues are.
Yeah, and it's a decision you have to make, right? And Alistair Dobson, who's headed the BBL for the last few years, he has been on record in the past talking about how his role is to focus on making the Big Bash a viable product or a better product than it was the previous year. His job is not to produce future superstars for Australia. And that's kind of ironic when you think of the promos that I grew up on about Australian domestic cricket, Jarrod. The Sheffield Shield has started now, but back in the day when they started suddenly showing the Sheffield Shield and whatever the One Day Cup was called at that point, Pura or what, I don't know, in the late 90s, early 2000s.
ING Cup, Mercantile Mutual Cup,
I think so, yeah, one of those at that point. And I'll never forget the promo. It said, Australia, the domestic cricket in Australia, the breeding ground of future champions. And that's what it was. Like, we all looked at it in awe. And I remember
Imran Khan's still copying it in Pakistan, right? Like, he's still copying the Sheffield Shield.
He is.
So you know how powerful that messaging and that theory has been.
Oh, yeah. I mean, about, how you have to wait till you're 34 to make it through, even if you are as good as a Michael Hussey or a Brad Hodge. And the brutality of the system where you can't just be good, you have to be great for a long time. And that was the messaging around Australia. And it helped that they were such a mighty team on the field as an international team. They were winning World Cups and winning Test series all over the place. But yeah, and so you can still use the same messaging. But if you are Alistair Dobson, if you are in charge of the BBL, or even if you are Cricket Australia, you're also dealing with cricket's become a broadcasting sport anyway, right? It's a TV sport, as you know, or if not a TV sport, at least the broadcasters have a much bigger say. So you're also in a way trying to appease them. And I thought the BBL draft, and I wrote about this as well when it happened, was almost, this was bizarre the way it played out. And for me, the things that stood out, and it's the odd things that stand out for you and me, Jarrod. That's why we are who we are, and the relationship we share. It was the fact that the name Andre Russell was taken more often than some of those who did get drafted. Like it was. I don't know whether you watched it
No,
live.
I didn't see it.
It must have been too early for you in the morning. Um, they the teams were sitting around in a room, four on each table, and Mark Howard was just walking around asking them some questions. And at every point, when Andre Russell wasn't being drafted in the first two rounds, uh, the experts would say, "Oh, but Andre Russell's still there. Andre Russell's still there." And then even when they would speak to Ricky Ponting or Jason Gillespie, they would mention the same thing. Oh, we're surprised that Andre Russell's name is still there. So his name got taken more often than, like, some of the slightly or relatively unknown names that got picked up later, but nobody picked him. Similarly with, say, a Faf du Plessis or even Pollard or Bravo. So it's almost like Cricket Australia convinced these guys or coaxed them to uh, use their names, or, like, get their names in the pool. But then the teams decided, well, but we're here to win this tournament. Like, so, if you were running the Adelaide Strikers, if you were Jason Gillespie or Ricky Ponting, like, what am I to think? Like, I should bring someone in who will play 3 matches for me, but it'll do good for the BBL. I mean, or promote the BBL in front of the broadcasters' eyes, or should I focus on winning cricket matches for my team? I thought they put the franchises or the team managers in a very precarious position, and obviously they went with what is good for their own business, or at least the business of winning, which is what any sporting team should do, and which adds to the whole idea of the BBL, like you said, not being a top line T20 league product, which you have to face the fact that is what it is.
Yeah, it's gone from Chris Gale taking up 80% of Sydney Thunder's spending in the first tournament to basically being the tournament of Evan Gulbis. And if you don't know who
Yes.
Evan Gulbis is, he tried very hard and was he could bat and he could bowl and he could field, but he wasn't ever going to play for Australia. He wasn't ever going to be a
Yes.
star, but he got a lot of games for Melbourne Stars. I can't remember if he played for anyone else as well. But that's the kind of league that it is, and it's the whole thing's really interesting. Anyway, mate, I can't wait to read your article in 7 or 8 months when you finish it, but in time for the next Big Bash. I'll just
Of course.
or in 7 or 8 months there'll be like 4 more World Cups by then. But after the break, we're going to talk about some of the funniest things that have happened in cricket this week.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
So I contacted you today because this is our first episode. So we've probably done more research on today's episode than we'll ever do throughout the whole rest of the thing. But I said to you, this really funny thing happened where the funniest moment in cricket this week was when Shaun Tait had a press conference. He's the bowling coach for Pakistan, which is kind of funny in itself because no one I can't imagine any other cricket team outside of Afghanistan or Pakistan would hire Shaun Tait as their bowling coach. But just like, he bowls really fast, he'll be a great coach. I love the thinking there. He goes up to do a press conference, and when you see him, you can see that he's clearly been running up the stairs, and he mentions the stairs about 4 times in the first 10 seconds. It's before the press conference starts, and he's sort of looking out at all these faces, and he says, we've lost really badly when I'm doing the press conference. Now, this is what's funny about this, is the Pakistani media got very upset. I got one of the more known people saying to me, you could see how upset Shaun Tait was and how offended he was. And I was like, no, that's pretty much what Australians would say in that situation. But also, what I found really funny was that they thought this was like a one-off thing. This has been going on, I would for you and me, I would say maybe the last 10 years we have noticed that assistant coaches basically get sent up to talk if the team is losing. Is that it? Would you agree with me?
I think longer. From the time I started cricket journalism in 2008, that's been the day. That's been the job of the fielding coach.
Oh, the fielding coach. I love a good fielding coach.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, there's still, and no offense to any fielding coach out there, but
Trevor Penny, if you're listening.
Oh, I love Trevor Penny, and he did do quite a few press conferences
course he
while he
did.
was India's fielding coach. But the funniest for me was when there was a phase in Indian cricket around 2009-10 when Pragyan Oja, who would be part of the squad, and invariably at that point not or often not part of the playing 11. And when MS Dhoni was captain, for some reason it was always Pragyan Oja who used to be sent to do a press conference on a bad day, even when he wasn't playing. And you would see, and these are Indian press conference rooms, right? The 50 or 60 journalists back then in one room. And the moment you would see Pragyan Oja walk in, there would be like 45 of them would just walk past him, like kind of push him out of the way and just walk out of the room. And there would be occasions where people would say, "Why have you come?" And Pragyan Oja would like, "But the team sent me, but we don't want to talk to you." And two questions, and then there would be some others like us who would just feel bad for Pragyan Oja, and we would ask him some generic
How's
question
life?
which would make no sense. How's life? Yeah, I know the chair. Is the chair comfortable, Pragyan? Yeah.
I'm trying to remember when the one I'm trying to remember what it was, but I know it was at the Rose Bowl, or what's it called now, the Aegeus Bowl, where Sri Lanka had toured. And for some reason, the Sri Lankan press must have been told after a bad day that they weren't sending anyone special, and so it was just Cricinfo, Cricbuzz, and the English journalists in the room, and and they sent out their fielding coach. I think it might have been a bowling coach, whoever it was. It wasn't a famous former player. Do you know what I mean? No one knew who this person was. There's no Sri Lankans in the room other than this random guy, and I can't remember who it was, but it was one of the English press went. It might have been Ali Martin actually just said, "Sorry, just before we start, who are you?" And it was just showed how ridiculous the whole situation was. But I found that very funny that the Pakistanis thought that was that was a novel thing or whatever. I was like, no. The novel thing was that for some reason the PCB put up the footage of him saying it at the start rather than editing it out when they put it online. Because usually you would edit out the bits before the questions anyway. So I told you about this, and you're like, "That is funny." And then straight away, you then mentioned your good friend Mitchell Johnson was playing in the Legends League and had a physical fight with Yusuf Pathan. Which, look, we don't, this is our first episode. We got to set the we got to set the scene. We don't condone physical violence, unless in your case you like it when people are wearing spangly underwear. But
True.
generally
Exactly.
we don't condone physical violence. But it is hilarious that these two, Yusuf Pathan and then Irfan Pathan and Mitchell Johnson, got so upset that there was a physical alteration in an old man cricket league.
Yeah, I mean, the Legends Cricket League is all about smiles and hits and giggles, and everybody gets along with everyone else, and they talk about the good old times. So, and the thing is, I did not even know that it was live on TV in Australia. I was just switching channels. I was like, "Hey, Legends Cricket League, let's see what Mitch is up to." So I switch it on, and as it turns out, it was a 15th over of the innings for the Bilwara Giants, I think they call.
Sounds like you made that
And
up,
Yusuf
but continue.
Pathan. Yeah, I'm sure I did. So Yusuf Pathan was already smashing it. Obviously, the boundaries had been, you could see that the ropes had been brought in quite a bit in Jodhpur, which hasn't seen cricket in a long time, international cricket, I would assume. And then Mitch takes the ball at third over of a spell, I think. And he runs in a couple of balls. I think a wide Yorker hit for six. There are a couple of boundaries. And the last ball, he bowls a bouncer. And Yusuf Pathan is imploring that the umpire signals wide. And then you can see Yusuf Pathan just walking down the pitch. And I just thought and I just really thought it was all just in jest. Yusuf Pathan asking the umpire to signal a wide and finding out what's happening. I did not know that at the other end of the pitch, it was Mitchell Johnson that he was having a go at. And before you knew it, like they were at each other's throats, and Mitch Johnson just pushes him away. And then he's dragged away. Of course, Yusuf Pathan gets out in the next over. And in walks Irfan. And you could see that Irfan was really fired up even before he ran out. And Irfan runs out and he's right into Mitch Johnson. And they get into quite a serious argument. And there were no physical contact between those two. And again, they have to be separated. All of this in a Legends Cricket League, and which has been going on for the last 2.5 weeks or so. You would have thought by now everybody would be friends and pally, and Yeah, I never expected to see that. And I read somewhere, I don't know whether it's true or not, that the tournament organizers were looking at seeing if Mitch should be suspended for the final because his team, the India Capitals, have qualified for the final, which is all bizarre when it happened in a Legends League context.
But also just like, it's the best thing that's ever happened in the Legends League. And
That is also very true.
so, I mean, maybe they have to suspend him because there was a physical alteration, but there's a part of me that thinks that they should actually have encouraged their players to do this sort of stuff, even fake it. So those are the first two things that happened that were pretty funny. The third one is kind of funny and kind of sad and kind of weird. Just before we started recording, I'll read the ESPN headline. Shimron Hetmyer dropped from West Indies World Cup squad over missed flight. As Shamar Brooks has been called up into the squad, that's not a like for like, is it? That's the least like for like replacement I can think of for Shimron Hetmyer. The story gets a lot weirder though when you start to read down that essentially Shimron Hetmyer was given 2 flights. The first one he couldn't go on, he said, for, I'm trying to think if it was family reasons, I think was the reason he gave. They then booked him for a second flight on the 3rd of October. So he hasn't technically, I don't think he technically missed that at that stage, but he basically said he wasn't going to go to it. And so the selection committee decided not to take him. Now, we don't know anything about this other than it's just happened, but who on earth thought this was going to be a story today, that one of the best players from the West Indies was not going to be traveling over a missed flight? And if I'm not mistaken, didn't Fabian Allen miss like a CPL over a missed flight? Like, hasn't there been, I've got a feeling there's been a couple of West Indian players over the last couple of years who've done that. But it did remind me of one of my favorite stories, which was when Bryce McGain finally got picked for Australia. He was supposed to play against India, do you remember? And he injured his shoulder and couldn't play. Took him forever to recover from that shoulder injury. He probably hadn't recovered from it. They picked him for the flight. He's 104 years old, Bryce McGain, at this point. He's been waiting to play for Australia his whole life, and then he misses the flight out to South Africa. Bit different with Shimron Hetmyer. We'll obviously get more details than that, but we weren't. I don't think anyone must had any money on Shimron Hetmyer not playing the World Cup because he had a fight with Cricket West Indies over which flight he should go on. That's a bit of a random one.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of the late Runako Morton. And remember, he was supposed to play in the 2007 World Cup, and he said his grandma was sick, and then it turned out there was no grandma, and he just made it all up because he didn't want to play for some bizarre reason. And we've seen this with West Indies cricket on and off, right? Players just kind of coming up with reason. There was the funniest is it's slightly different to what has happened with Shimron Hetmyer, but West Indies A was touring India in 2014, I would like to believe, 2013. And one of their players, who still does occasionally play for West Indies, got injured during the first week of that tour. And nobody in Cricket West Indies was aware of that. So I wanted to interview said player. And 3-4 days into the tour, I found out that he was injured. And this information came from Bangalore, where they were based. So I called up some people I knew in Cricket West Indies, and I said, "Do you know that so-and-so player is injured?" They were like, "Oh, really? Oh, we had no idea." And they had to then quickly find a replacement, and they sent the replacement. But this is the best part of the story. So it was a month-long tour. So the said player who had been injured, he'd been given allowances, like, as a bulk for the entire month. So they told the player that, okay, you just like leave whatever is, or you have to like pass on or whatever money you have for the rest of the month for the replacement player. And he says, "Oh, I've spent it all off." And so he was injured, not playing, but he had a lot of money. So, he just spent it all off doing whatever you do in Bangalore to have a good time.
Beer cafes.
And then of course, yeah. He went to Koshi's and had way too many coffees, I guess. And eventually, Cricket West Indies had to kind of get the Karnataka State Cricket Association to just help them out in the immediate in that point, so that the replacement player, has his allowance sorted, and so that they could then work it out with their the other players. So it was just really funny, like the way it played out. So interesting things to happen with West Indies cricket, and Shimron Hetmyer is one of those, right? He's had weight issues, fitness issues, he's such a fun player to watch
Well,
when he gets going. And
before this World Cup, we weren't sure if he was going to be made available or if he was going to get
Yeah.
picked because of fitness. I assume there's something else going on with those two
Yeah,
things.
for sure.
I mean, the story doesn't quite make sense. I know Cricket Info have just put it up and it's just happened, so no one will know all the details. But you read it and you're just like, I don't know if this is right. But either way, it's a huge boom for, I mean, in some ways, Shamar Brooks is the John O'Wells of West Indies. So great that he's coming out to Australia for the World Cup. Bharat, thank you for coming on, and I'll see you again next week on, what's this show called? I named it. I've already forgotten. Uncovered on 99.94.
Thank you so much. And I hope you don't forget who your co-host is next week. But yeah, I look forward
Is it
to
you?
it. Hopefully it is me.